When you hear Shaolin Monastery, your mind probably floods with images, gravity-defying leaps, lightning-fast punches, quiet contemplation, all wrapped up in this aura of ancient wisdom and martial prowess.
Definitely. It's an image broadcast globally through movies and pop culture.
But how much of that vivid picture is the real, dusty history, and how much is just, well, a really good story?
That contrast is exactly why this deep dive is so compelling. We're working with excerpts from Meir Shahar's book, The Shaolin Monastery, History, Religion, and the Chinese Martial Arts, which takes on the ambitious task of peeling back the layers of myth to reveal the documented history.
So our mission here is to use these sources as our guide, almost like historical detectives. We're going to journey through Shaolin's 1,500-year history, searching for the actual origins of its martial practices, trying to understand the seemingly paradoxical connection between Buddha's monks and fighting, and seeing how those powerful legends were built and woven into the fabric of its identity.
And it's particularly relevant because, as you said, Shaolin's global fame today is immense. Think about Bruce Lee referencing Shaolin techniques or Jet Li starring in movies explicitly about the temple.
Yeah, absolutely.
That pop culture image raises fundamental questions. Was this fame earned through historical martial achievement? Did the monks truly fight? And if they did, how did they reconcile that with the core Buddhist tenets of nonviolence?
That reconciliation feels like the central mystery here. Let's start at the very beginning. Shaolin wasn't founded as a martial arts school, was it?
Absolutely not. The sources tell us the monastery was founded in the last decade of the 5th century, likely around 495, 496 CE, by an Indian monk named Batuo, or Fatuo.
Batuo, an Indian monk.
Yes, he was invited to China by Emperor Shaowen of the Northern Wei dynasty to establish a monastery near the capital.
Okay, so we're talking the late 400s. And where exactly did they choose to build this monastery?
It's in Dengfeng County, deep in central Henan province. This area is strategically significant, about 30 miles southeast of Luoyang, which was the Northern Wei capital at the time.
Right, Luoyang.
And around 45 miles southwest of modern Zhengzhou. It's nestled right under Mount Shaoxi, which is part of the larger Mount Song range.
So the name Shaolin connects directly to the geography, Mount Shaoxi.
That's the widely accepted interpretation presented in the source. It means Shaoxi's grove, referring to its location within the ancient woodland on Mount Shaoxi.
Shaoxi's grove. Okay, that makes sense. And even in its early days, Shaolin quickly became important beyond just its location.
It did. The sources acknowledge its significant contribution to Chinese Buddhism and Chinese culture generally. It wasn't just some remote temple. It became a notable center of Buddhist activity and learning fairly quickly.
How are we able to piece together this ancient history? I mean, what kind of records survive from 1,500 years ago?
Well, the primary sources are crucial here, and Shahar's work relies heavily on them. Foremost are the Shaolin steels. These are large stone slabs with carved inscriptions.
Deals. Okay, like monuments.
Exactly. And we have some incredibly early ones dating back to the 6th and 7th centuries. They weren't just random carvings. They were often commissioned by powerful figures and bestowed upon the monastery, like Empress Wu during the Tang Dynasty, or even the Qianlong Emperor much later in the Qing.
So these are official imperial records etched in stone. That sounds like solid evidence.
Precisely. They detail aspects of the monastery's religious life, its economic dealings, its relationship with the imperial court. The sources also mention historical writings based on these records, like Fu Mei's Song Mountain Book, a comprehensive history of the temple from the Ming Dynasty that includes biographies of eminent monks and transcriptions of those very steels.
Fu Mei's book, okay.
Yeah, these provide a documentary bedrock for understanding its history.
All right, we've laid the historical foundation. Now let's talk about the figure everyone associates with Shaolin, the one whose story is almost synonymous with it in the popular imagination. Bodhidharma.
Ah, yes. Bodhidharma, known as Damo in China. He's revered as the first patriarch of Chan or Zen Buddhism in China. And in popular culture, he's often seen as the father of Shaolin martial arts.
Right, the one who taught the monks exercises because they were too weak for meditation. The whole story.
That's him, the legendary figure who meditated facing a wall. But this is where Shahar's historical investigation becomes particularly revealing.
Okay.
While scholars generally agree that Bodhidharma was a real person, an Indian, possibly Persian, missionary active in the Luoyang area around 480 to 520 CE, roughly the same time Shaolin was founded.
So he was real and in the right area at the right time, sort of.
Yes, but they are very skeptical about his direct role in founding the Chan school itself, which seems to have coalesced as a distinct lineage much later, and his connection to martial arts that's largely dismissed as a much later legend.
So the famous story of him arriving at Shaolin, seeing the weak monks, and teaching them the Yi Jin Jing, the sinuous transformation classic that isn't historical?
According to the early records examined in the sources, no, that narrative doesn't hold up. What Shahar shows is how this legend developed over time, evolving through different texts over centuries.
How did that evolution happen? Can we trace it?
We can. Let's trace it. In the early 6th century, a text called the Luoyang Quilon Ji, record of Buddhist monasteries in Luoyang, mentions Bodhidharma visiting Luoyang and praising its monasteries.
Okay.
But makes no mention of him going to Mount Song or Shaolin at all.
No mention of Shaolin yet.
None. Fast forward about a century to the mid-7th century text Zhu Gao Senghuan, continuation of the biographies of eminent monks, and he's now placed as active in the broader Mount Song-Liang region.
Ah, okay. So the geographic link to the mountain starts to appear. He's getting closer.
Exactly. Then by the early 8th century, texts like the Chuanfa Baoji, precious record of the Dharma's transmission, explicitly identify Bodhidharma with Shaolin Monastery.
There it is. 8th century.
Right. This is the point where the famous story of him meditating facing a wall there for years is recorded, and it also includes the story of his disciple Huike cutting off his arm to demonstrate his devotion.
Wow, okay, so the core story of Bodhidharma being at Shaolin, tied to the wall-facing meditation, appears in texts from the 8th century. But still no martial arts.
Still no mention of martial arts connection in these early stages, but the veneration for him at Shaolin only grew from this point. In 1125, during the Song dynasty, the first patriarch's hermitage, Juzuan, was built specifically to commemorate his legendary solitary meditation spot, located about a half-mile from the main monastery complex.
A specific building dedicated to him.
Yes, and the source notes that this hermitage, still preserved today, is artistically significant, with beautiful Song dynasty stone carvings and reliefs. So while the martial arts link is absent early on, Shaolin itself embraced the Bodhidharma myth as central to its religious lineage relatively early.
The religious connection is clear and developed over centuries, but the martial arts part seems distinct. And this brings us back to that core paradox. How does a Buddhist monastery known for pacifism become famous for fighting?
This is the fundamental contradiction that the sources grapple with. Buddhist monastic law, the Vinaya, is very clear and strict. It explicitly forbids violence and warfare. Monks take vows that include not taking life.
So, for monks to engage in combat, potentially killing people, that's a direct violation of their core vows. How on earth did they justify this? Did they feel conflicted? Seems like a huge problem.
That's what we have to try and understand from the records. The sources suggest a couple of potential explanations that allowed for this deviation. One is quite practical, economic necessity.
Okay. How so?
In the medieval period, Shaolin was a large, wealthy institution with extensive land holdings. The source mentions a large estate. In times of political instability and banditry, which were pretty common throughout Chinese history, this property needed defense.
Right, bandits and chaos.
So martial training might have arisen, at least in part, from the need to protect the monastery's physical assets and its inhabitants.
Like needing a security force, but the monks became the force themselves.
In part, yes. But the sources also point to a fascinating religious justification. The presence of military gods within Buddhist iconography itself.
Military gods in Buddhism. That still sounds counterintuitive for a religion of peace.
It does, initially. But the sources highlight how traditional Buddhist temples often feature figures like the heavenly kings or guardian deities flanking the Buddha image. These figures, such as Vajrapâni, are depicted as heavily armed, ferocious,
You see those statues.
and shown actively subduing or trampling demons and obstacles to the Dharma.
Okay, so there are divine protectors in the pantheon.
Yeah.
Fierce ones.
Exactly. And the argument arises. If the Buddha himself required the protection of these powerful martial deities to safeguard the Dharma from evil, then perhaps the monastic community, representing the Buddha's presence in the world, also required the physical protection provided by martial monks.
Ah, see. The monks are acting as earthly protectors, mirroring the divine ones.
This concept of divine protectors could provide a religious rationale for monastic self-defense. It reframes the violence not as aggression, but as protection of the sacred.
So they weren't fighting for conquest, but as earthly manifestations of divine protection against evil. That does reframe it.
It offers a potential theological lens through which the monks might have viewed their actions. Now, historically, documenting monastic fighting is tricky because Buddhist sources themselves are often reluctant to record instances that show monks violating the Vinaya's prohibition on violence.
Right. They'd want to maintain the ideal image.
Precisely. They might try to explain it away, perhaps by claiming monks were coerced into fighting by secular authorities, as was argued for some 5th century northern Liang monks.
Okay, so Buddhist sources might be biased towards minimizing it. What about other sources?
Well, the sources contrast this with Confucian histories, the official dynastic records. The compilers of these histories, often viewing Buddhism with some suspicion as a foreign faith, apparently recorded with relish instances where monks were involved in armed conflicts, especially revolts.
Ah, so they saw it as proof of potential disorder associated with monasteries, using it against Buddhism, maybe.
Exactly, using it to make a point about the supposed dangers of the faith. And these records provide historical examples. Monks were involved in revolts during the chaotic transition from the Sui to the Tang dynasty in the 610s, and this involvement continued into the Tang.
Real examples of monks fighting in rebellions.
Yes, and the source shares a vivid anecdote from 815 CE during an attempted coup by Li Shidao. A fierce monk named Yuan Jing from a monastery near Shaolin was a prominent fighter for the rebels when captured and tortured.
Oh, wow.
Even when a soldier tried to break his legs with a sledgehammer, he apparently spread them and taunted the soldier, saying he wasn't strong enough to break a fella's shin.
That's intense. A far cry from the serene, quiet monk image. Yuan Jing sounds incredibly defiant and physically tough.
He certainly does. This shows that despite the monastic rules, some monks were clearly involved in secular warfare, and these actions were noted, sometimes with a distinct perspective, in official histories.
This sets the stage for what is perhaps the most famous early historical instance of Shaolin monks in battle supporting Li Shimin, the future Tang Emperor Taizong. This is where the story of the 13 fighting monks comes from, right?
Yes, this is the pivotal historical event that provides the firmest early evidence of Shaolin monks engaging in military action documented by the state. The context is the war between Li Shimin and the rebel leader Wang Shichong, fought in the early 7th century, specifically around 620-621 CE.
Okay, early Tang dynasty formation.
Right. Li Shimin was besieging Wang Shichong's capital, Liang, and trying to cut off his supply lines.
And how did Shaolin get involved in this war?
The key source here is the Shaolin Monastery stele, which provides the account. It attests that shortly before Li Shimin's decisive victory over another rebel leader, Du Xiande, at Hulou Pass in May 621, Shaolin monks took military action.
Against whom?
A contingent of Wang Shichong's army had occupied a strategically important hill called Mount Huanyuan, which happened to be where Shaolin's Cypress Valley estate was located.
Ah, so there's that economic motivation, again, protecting their property. It keeps coming up.
That appears to be the immediate cause, yes. The stele records that the monks, acting militarily, defeated Wang Shichong's troops on Mount Huanyuan and even captured a key figure, Wang Shichong's nephew, Wang Renzi.
They captured a high-ranking enemy officer, Wang Renzi. That's more than just driving off intruders. That's significant military action.
It's a significant military contribution. And Li Shimin, the future Emperor Taizong, recognized it as such. In gratitude for their assistance, he bestowed the Cypress Valley estate back to the monastery.
How big was this estate?
We're talking about a substantial amount of land here, approximately 560 acres, or 40 king in the traditional measure, a significant economic asset. He also granted them a watermill.
Wow, land and infrastructure.
And, critically, he appointed one of the monks, the name isn't given in the excerpt we have, to a high military rank, that of General-in-Chief Do Zhengjun in his army.
Appointing a monk as a general. That's incredible.
Yeah.
It shows the value he placed on their military support, even if it defied monastic norms.
It completely cuts across the image of pacifist monks. And the source notes that subsequent imperial support for Shaolin from the Tang court, like that from Emperor Xuanzang in the 8th century, was explicitly framed as being because of the monks' military assistance to his predecessor, Taizong.
Not for their piety.
Not primarily for their Buddhist piety, no. Xuanzang, in fact, was known for trying to curb the power of Buddhist monasteries. Their fame and official patronage from the Tang dynasty were directly tied to their martial actions in this conflict.
Okay, so the historical evidence is clear. Shaolin monks fought, they were effective, and they were rewarded handsomely for it by the future emperor. But how did their actual fighting style develop? What were they practicing back then?
That's a great question. While pop culture often focuses on bare-handed kung fu and a variety of weapons, historical sources, particularly from the Ming Dynasty onwards, strongly emphasize one weapon above others: the staff.
The staff, really, not the elaborate hand forms or swords we often see in movies.
The staff gun appears to have been the quintessential Shaolin weapon in the historical record, especially as written manuals begin to emerge much later in the Ming.
Okay, Ming Dynasty onwards.
Yeah, a crucial source here is Cheng Zongyu's manual, the Shaolin Staff Method, compiled around 1610.
Who was Cheng Zongyu? Was he a monk?
No, he was a lay military expert and part of the educated elite illiterati who was keenly interested in martial arts. His reason for writing the manual is insightful.
What was his reason?
He observed that the Shaolin staff method was incredibly effective, but was only transmitted orally from master to disciple. He was worried it would be lost, so he wanted to preserve it in a written record with illustrations.
So a scholar official documented the monks' techniques to save them. That's fascinating. What did the manual describe?
It included detailed drawings and rhyming formulas, Mkiju, designed to help practitioners remember the movements. His philosophy, as described, emphasized internal strength, namely, and achieving a kind of fluid spontaneity.
Internal strength, right?
Captured in phrases like mind conceiving, hands responding. He contrasted this with crude, brute force, using almost poetic comparisons like a beautiful woman plucking flowers or a literatus laying down his brush to describe the refined agility required.
Those are beautiful metaphors for something as physical as fighting with a staff. Almost contradictory.
They are, aren't they? The source also mentions a specific technique, the 5 Tigers Interception Staff Method, described by another writer, Wushu. He noted its apparent simplicity, comparing it to a farmer hoeing.
Like simple, basic movements.
Seemingly. But he stressed its practical effectiveness, stating that by simply striking down and up, one obtains strength. This paints a picture of a style focused on powerful, functional, maybe deceptively simple movements.
So the staff was central to their martial identity from the Ming period documented sources.
Yeah.
But the staff has a different, older significance in Buddhism itself, doesn't it? Not just as a weapon.
Absolutely. This is where the practical and the spiritual intertwine in a fascinating way. The staff isn't just a weapon, it's a traditional emblem of a Buddhist monk. Early medieval monastic regulations actually prescribed it as one of the 18 belongings a monk was supposed to carry.
One of their essential items. What kind of staff was this ritual one?
It's a specific type called a ring staff, or kakara in Sanskrit, sisang in Chinese. It has metal lukes or finials at the top with loose metal rings, often made of tin or pewter.
Rings. Why rings?
These rings make a distinctive rattling sound when the staff is moved. The sound had a practical purpose: to announce the monk's presence and scare away small animals or insects, preventing the monk from accidentally stepping on them and violating the non-killing precept.
Practical and fulfilling a religious rule.
Clever.
So it was both functional and symbolic of a traveling monk's life.
Yes. And what's striking is the visual resemblance between this ritual ring staff and the fighting staff. There are even instances mentioned in sources where the ring staff or something very similar was used in martial demonstrations.
So there's a clear physical link between the ritual object and the weapon. But you mentioned it was also seen as a magic weapon in ritual contexts. How does that work?
This goes back deep into Buddhist folklore and ritual. The staff features prominently in the legend of Mulian, a famous disciple of the Buddha who journeys through hell to rescue his mother.
The Mulian story, right?
In this legend, Mulian's ring staff isn't just for sound, it's an active, powerful tool. By rattling, yao, or shaking, zen it, he could literally mow down hordes of ghosts and break open the gates of hell.
Wow, the sound had magical, destructive power against evil forces in the story.
Precisely. The source notes that plays depicting the Mulian legend were performed during events like the Ghost Festival, Yulan Pen, or as part of funerary rites. During these rituals, priests would physically wield a ring staff and smash a replica of hell to symbolically liberate the soul of the deceased.
Smashing a model hell with the staff.
Yes, and the ring staff is still used as a magic weapon in some Chinese religious practices today.
That adds such a rich layer of meaning. The physical weapon of the monks is connected to an object with ancient symbolic and even magical power in Buddhist ritual and folklore.
It really underscores how the sacred and the profane, the spiritual and the physical were deeply intertwined in these traditions. It wasn't necessarily seen as a contradiction in the same way we might view it.
Speaking of spiritual power and martial action, Let's return to that concept of military deities. You mentioned Vajrapâni as a guardian god, but he became Shaolin's specific martial protector. How did that happen?
Yes. Vajrapâni, Shingangshin, also identified with Narayana, Elohim, is a standard Buddhist divine warrior, armed and often shown defeating demons. He's a common figure. But at Shaolin, he developed a special status, becoming their specific tutelary or protector deity in a way he wasn't at most other monasteries.
So he was the martial god for Shaolin specifically. And how did he get linked to the staff, since his traditional weapon is the Vajra, the thunderbolt scepter?
This is where Shaolin legend really takes a specific turn, adapting the broader figure. There's a famous Shaolin legend found in several Ming sources, including Cheng Zongyu's preface and Fu Mei's book.
The same guys who wrote about the staff method in history.
Exactly. In this legend, Vajrapâni manifests not as a majestic god, but in a very humble form, as a lowly scullion, a kitchen worker at the monastery.
A kitchen helper.
Yes. When bandits attack, this unassuming scullion suddenly displays divine power and defeats them, wielding a divine staff, not his usual Vajra.
So the legend adapted the deity's weapon to match the monk's specialty. That's brilliant.
It seems so. By giving the divine protector a staff, the legend made him the divine progenitor of Shaolin's own renowned staff techniques, thereby sacralizing their martial practice. It gives it a divine origin story linked directly to their preferred weapon.
And this legend is even reflected in the temple's art, you said.
Yes, a 1517 stele, mentioned in the source, depicts the deity with a long staff instead of his traditional short Vajra.
That's a specific historical date where we see the visual representation changing to reflect this new legend. Very cool.
It's a powerful piece of evidence for the legend's integration into the temple's identity. The legend also sometimes elevates Vajrapâni Narayana to a bodhisattva, even an incarnation of Avalokitesvara, Guanyin, the bodhisattva of compassion.
How does that work? A violent protector being an aspect of Guanyin.
Well, the source notes that the Lotus Sutra teaches that bodhisattvas can assume various forms, including that of a Vajra-wielding spirit, to help sentient beings. So there's a scriptural basis provided for this seemingly contradictory manifestation.
Okay, a theological move to reconcile the idea of a violent protector being an aspect of a compassionate being. Makes sense within that framework.
It brings the martial aspect into the bodhisattva framework. And interestingly, in this legend, Kinara, another name used for this deity at Shaolin, is often depicted as a holy fool.
Holy fool.
Yeah, a menial worker in rags, disheveled, seemingly ignoring monastic rules. This presentation as a hidden divinity, someone whose true power is masked by a humble or unconventional exterior, is a theme found elsewhere in Chinese religion, like with figures such as Crazy G.
The divine power hidden in plain sight. I like that.
Yes, and the enduring significance of this deity at Shaolin is evident. The source describes numerous icons within the monastery, a statue standing in the snow pavilion, a mural in the white-attired Mahasattva Hall, and a dedicated Kinara Hall chapel with multiple statues.
So he's really prominent there.
Very much so. His cult was clearly rejuvenated after the monastery's major fire in 1928 and subsequent reconstruction in 1984 and 2004, showing its continued importance into modern times.
And there's a detail about a specific wickerwork statue there. Something about it being self-sculpted.
Right. There's a legend about a wickerwork statue in the Kinara Hall. Originally woven by the monks, a century later, the common belief was that the deity himself sculpted it. Shahar suggests this reflects a cultural anxiety about the authenticity of a deity's image, a self-sculpted image being the most truthful and thus most worthy of worship.
That's a fascinating insight into the intersection of belief, art, and authenticity. So this martial deity cult provided a religious justification for fighting, particularly with the staff, and this becomes very visible during the Ming Dynasty's anti-pirate campaigns, right?
Absolutely. This is one of the most extensively documented periods of Shaolin military involvement. In 1553, during the peak of the Wokou, often called Japanese pirates, though the groups were more complex raids along China's coast, military officials made a conscious decision to mobilize monastic troops, known as Sengbing.
Monastic troops Sengbing.
Yes, and Wan Biao was the official who spearheaded this effort.
And we have detailed records of these campaigns, like who wrote about them?
The most important source is Zheng Ruheng's The Monastic Army's First Victory, included in his larger work, The Strategic Defense of the Jiangnan Region, written around 1568. Zheng was directly involved, serving as an advisor to Supreme Commander Hu Zongxian, so his account is based on first-hand knowledge.
An insider's account. Where did these monastic troops fight?
The source lists specific battles where monastic troops were recorded. Mount Z in the spring of 1553, Wengjigang in July 1553, Majiabang in the spring of 1554, and Taozai in the autumn of 1555.
Did they always win?
No, they didn't. The source notes a monastic defeat at Taozai, where 4 monks died, and were later commemorated under a stupa of the 4 heroic monks.
A memorial stupa for fallen warrior monks. What was their biggest success?
Their major victory was at Wengjiagan on July 21st, 1553. According to Zheng's account, a force of 120 fighting monks engaged a group of pirates and routed them, pursuing the survivors for 10 days.
10 days.
Yeah. Over 100 pirates were killed, while only 4 monks were lost.
That's a significant military achievement for a relatively small force. A very favorable kill ratio, if you look at it starkly. The source mentions a particularly harsh detail from this campaign, though.
Yes, it's a stark reminder of the realities of war and the tension with monastic vows. Zheng Ruosheng recounts a monk using his iron staff to kill an escaping pirate's wife.
Killing a civilian woman.
The account presents it simply, highlighting the disregard for the Buddhist prohibition on killing, even targeting someone who might not have been an active combatant. It shows how, in the context of intense conflict, religious prohibitions could be overridden or perhaps just ignored.
That's sobering. Were all the monks in these campaigns from Shaolin itself?
The source clarifies that not all the Sengbing were from Shaolin, and the ranks likely included monks recruited or trained elsewhere for the specific purpose of these campaigns. However, the leader who guided them, particularly to the victory at Wengjiagang, was Tianyuan, explicitly identified as a Shaolin graduate. Zheng Ruosheng praised Tianyuan highly, noting his skills in both martial arts and strategic thinking.
And Tianyuan demonstrated his real Shaolin skills at one point, didn't he? There's an anecdote.
He did. Zhen describes an incident where 18 monks from Hangzhou challenged Tianyuan's command. Tianyuan, asserting his authority, declared, "I am real Shaolin," and when the Hangzhou monks tried to attack him using empty-handed techniques, attempting to climb stairs to reach him,
They challenged him physically.
Yes, and Tianyuan easily blocked them with his fists, proving his superior fighting skill without even needing his staff, apparently.
Wow. That anecdote feels like it jumped straight out of a martial arts novel, but it's recorded in a serious Ming Dynasty military history.
It does, doesn't it? It highlights the blending of military efficacy and legendary martial prowess. Zheng Ruosheng was so impressed by these monastic troops, and Tianyuan in particular, that he formally urged the government to make regular use of monastic armies in official campaigns.
So Shaolin was a prominent center, obviously, but this kind of monastic fighting wasn't necessarily confined to just that one location. How did these techniques spread?
One key mechanism was itinerant monks, wandering monks.
Right.
The source gives the example of Bianden, a Shaolin staff expert who had studied under a Tibetan master at the monastery. After completing his training, Bianden traveled widely, moving between centers like Shaolin and Mount Imai in Sichuan.
Mount Imai, another famous mountain.
Exactly. He likely transmitted the Shaolin staff and hand combat techniques he'd learned to monks and possibly lay practitioners in other regions.
So wandering monks acted as conduits for spreading these martial traditions, and temples themselves played a role as public spaces for martial arts, not just training grounds.
Absolutely. The source notes that in late imperial Chinese cities, temples were crucial public venues. Martial artists, part of the broad rivers and lakes or Jianghu community of itinerant performers, often made their living by demonstrating their skills on temple grounds.
Performing kung fu at temple fairs.
Yes, especially during temple fairs and religious festivals. A 17th century account mentions a temple in Shandong having some 10 wrestling platforms and theatrical stages, attracting huge crowds during its annual fair.
10 wrestling platforms.
Yeah, it really underscores the temple's function not just as a religious site, but also as a central public space for community events, including martial arts performance and practice.
Besides Shaolin, were there other monasteries or mountains known for martial arts that the sources mention?
Yes, the source discusses a couple of other significant centers, particularly among the 4 great mountains of Chinese Buddhism, famous pilgrimage sites. Mount Wutai in Shaanxi, associated with the Bodhisattva Manjushri, is one.
Mount Wutai. What's the evidence there for martial activity?
During the Jurchen siege of Taiyuan in 1126, during the Song dynasty, military officials appealed to Mount Wutai for support. The abbots agreed, and Wutai monks participated in the defense campaigns.
Monks defending a city.
Yes, and 2 monks, Li Shanwo and Du Taishi, were even appointed as vanguard generals in the imperial army.
More monk generals.
No.
It seems to be a recurring theme when monks get involved militarily.
Indeed. The source also highlights the story of the chief monk of Wutai at the time, Zhenbao. He was called to the capital during the dire final months of the Northern Song dynasty, promised the emperor he would fight, gathered monastic troops, and went to war.
Did he succeed?
No, he was defeated and captured by the Jurchens. But when offered mercy if he collaborated, he refused, stating his religious prohibitions against lying meant he had to keep his promise to the emperor to fight to the death.
Wow. Loyalty over survival.
His loyalty and bravery were so remarkable that he was given a biography in the Loyal Heroes section of the official song history.
That's a powerful example of monastic loyalty to the state being prioritized and recognized, even in official secular histories, despite the apparent conflict with monastic vows against killing.
It reveals the complex layers of identity and obligation these figures navigated. Another center mentioned is Mount Imei in Sichuan.
Imei, right. Also one of the four great mountains.
Yes, originally a significant Daoist mountain, it later became a Buddhist center associated with the Bodhisattva Samantabhadra. By the late Ming, both spear fighting and empty-handed combat were practiced there.
Spear fighting at Imei. Interesting. Different from the Shaolin staff focus.
Yes. The Imei spear method manual, dating from the early 17th century, records techniques taught by a monk named Puin. His lay student, Cheng Zhenru, recorded the techniques.
Another lay student recording monastic arts.
Exactly, but there's a famous anecdote associated with this. Cheng had to spend 2 full years simply gathering firewood for Prin as a test of his sincerity and dedication before the monk would agree to teach him the spear methods.
2 years of chopping wood, just to start learning. That gives you a sense of the commitment required, the master-disciple relationship.
Absolutely. And interestingly, a poem by Tang Xunzi from the late Ming Song of the Imei Monk's Fist mentions the fame of Shaolin's military prowess, indicating a broader awareness of these monastic martial traditions across different regions. Imei knew about Shaolin.
So we've seen the historical emphasis on the staff at Shaolin and other martial centers like Wutai and Imei. By the Qing dynasty, does Shaolin still focus primarily on the staff?
The sources suggest a shift occurred. By the Qing period, which began in 1644, bare-handed techniques seem to have become very prominent at Shaolin, perhaps even overshadowing the older staff methods in daily practice or demonstrations.
Really? How do we know that?
A telling detail comes from the visit of a Manchu official named Lin Qing in 1828. He observed a bare-handed sparring demonstration rather than a weapons display when he visited Shaolin. This suggests a shift in focus, or at least in what they chose to demonstrate.
So the bare-handed kung fu image, at least internally at Shaolin, seems to gain prominence later in the Qing. Are there manuals describing this Qing-era hand combat from Shaolin?
Yes, there are 2 key manuals from the Qing dynasty that purport to record Shaolin hand combat methods. One is the Hand Combat Classic, published with a preface by Cao Huandu in 1784,
Cao Huandu.
claiming to be based on the teachings of a lay practitioner named Zhang Kongzhao. The other is the Xuanji's Secret Transmission of Acupuncture Points Hand Combat Formulas, attributed to a Shaolin monk named Xuanji.
Are these texts related? They sound quite specific.
They show striking similarities, focusing on things like pressure points. Scholars like Shahar believe they derive from a common 17th century source text. They trace their lineage back through lay disciples Zhang Kongzhao and Zhang Ming to the monk Xuanji at Shaolin.
So again, the pattern holds. Lay practitioners documenting techniques transmitted by monks, preserving them in writing.
It seems to be a common mode of transmission and preservation for these arts.
What do these manuals, particularly Cao Huandu's preface from 1784, tell us about why people practiced martial arts at this time? Was it still just about fighting?
Cao Huandu's preface provides a really rich picture of the motivations. He mentions practical reasons like self-defense in a violent rural environment, which makes sense. But he also speaks of practicing for medical reasons to cure illness.
Health benefits.
Yes, and for self-cultivation, like personal development, and even for aesthetic reasons, striving for artistic perfection and expressing a contempt for crude brute force. He again uses that metaphor of a beautiful woman plucking flowers to describe the desired elegance.
So it wasn't just about fighting utility anymore. It was integrated into health, personal development, and even had an aesthetic ideal, much broader.
Exactly. And he introduces a clear religious dimension, too. He describes receiving teachings from a mysterious person and experiencing a dream revelation that allowed him to finally grasp the subtlety of key cultivation.
Key cultivation. Okay, now we're getting into internal energy practices. This sounds like it's connecting the martial arts directly to traditional Chinese medicine and perhaps Taoist ideas.
It absolutely does. This points strongly towards the integration of martial arts with older health and longevity practices. But before we delve deeper into that connection, it's worth looking at how barehanded combat was viewed by actual military figures during this period. Did they think it was useful in war?
Good point. What did the generals think?
The sources bring in the perspective of the famous Ming general Qi Zhiguang from his influential military treatise, the New Treatise on Military Efficiency, written back in the 16th century.
Qi Zhiguang, a major military figure.
Right. He surveyed the various hand combat methods of his time and, from a purely military standpoint, found them generally incomplete in themselves.
Incomplete for what purpose? On the battlefield, you mean?
Precisely. Qi Zhiguang's critical assessment was that barehanded methods were actually useless on the battlefield itself against opponents armed with spears, swords, and shields, which makes practical sense.
Okay, so not for actual frontline combat. But did he see any value in them?
He did, very much so. He saw them as highly valuable for two reasons. First, they helped instill courage and discipline in troops, getting them used to physical confrontation. And second, and perhaps most importantly from his perspective, they served as the essential foundation for all other martial training.
Ah, so barehanded was the prerequisite, the basic physical education for a soldier.
That was his argument. He stated that all armed techniques, staff, spear, sword, whatever, proceed from barehanded techniques. You train the body, balance, footwork, coordination, and basic movements using empty hands first, and then applied that foundation to weapons.
Train the body, then arm it.
Essentially, yes. His contemporary, another military writer named He Liangshan, echoed this, explicitly stating one should begin with hand combat and then progress to staff training. This provides a military context for why extensive barehanded practice was important, even if it wasn't intended as the primary combat method on the battlefield.
That makes a lot of sense. It's foundational training. This idea of building a physical foundation, coupled with Kawandu's mention of health and key cultivation, leads us naturally to the deep connection between martial arts and these ancient Chinese practices of nourishing life, right?
Exactly. This is where we see the integration with the ancient Chinese gymnastic tradition known as daoyin, which translates roughly as guiding and pulling.
Daoyin. How old is that?
This practice dates back centuries before the Common Era. It involves specific limb movements, stretching, postures, and coordinated breathing techniques.
What was the goal of Daoyin? Why were people doing these exercises back then?
It was primarily focused on health, preventing and curing disease, and on nourishing life yangsheng to promote longevity. The source references a passage in the ancient Taoist text, the Zhuangzi, describing people doing exercises like bear hangings and bird stretchings, concerned only with living a long life like the legendary Pengzu.
So health and long life. And this isn't just philosophical. There's physical evidence, actual manuals.
Yes, remarkably. 2nd century BCE manuals like the illustrations of guiding and pulling have been unearthed from tombs, like Mawangdui. These show detailed illustrations of various postures.
Wow, from 200 BCE.
Yes. And many of these postures are named after animals: bear, bird, crane, monkey, dragon, and so on.
So using animal names for movements like crane-style or monkey-style kung fu isn't unique to later martial arts. It goes back to these ancient gymnastic health practices. That's a really interesting connection.
Absolutely. It seems to be a shared lineage, or at least a shared conceptual framework. And while Daoyin was a broad tradition, Taoists particularly incorporated into their practices aimed at achieving physical immortality.
Immortality.
Yes. The Chinese philosophical view of the body and soul was often seen as more of a continuum than a strict duality, meaning cultivating the physical body was essential for preserving identity and achieving longevity, or even, in the Taoist ideal, physical immortality.
So physical cultivation was inherently tied to spiritual aspirations for longevity and even immortality in Taoism. This sounds like the fertile ground from which the idea of internal martial arts focused on ki and mind might have grown.
It certainly appears that way. The source highlights the emergence of what it calls a triple synthesis of religion, healing, and fighting, especially visible in late Ming sources. This is where the ancient Daoyin traditions became explicitly integrated with martial practice.
Religion, healing, and fighting all rolled into one. And the Yijin Jing, the Sinuous Transformation classic, is a prime example of this synthesis, the one supposedly written by Bodhidharma.
Yes, the Yujinjing manual, which likely originated around 1624 based on internal evidence like a postscript, is a key text in this development. It advocates for achieving both martial excellence and religious goals, often framed in terms of Taoist immortality, interestingly enough, not necessarily Buddhist enlightenment.
Taoist goals in a text linked to Bodhidharma.
Yes, and crucially, it incorporates daoyin exercises. Later manuals, including some claiming Shaolin connection and the foundational classics of famous internal styles like Taiji Quan and Jinji Quan, also included elements of daoyin.
So this is where concepts like breathing techniques and ki cultivation become central to these martial arts, not just external strength.
Precisely. The focus on specific breathing techniques and circulating ki, liang qi, is a core element derived from daoyin that was integrated into these fighting styles. The source references Tong Shinzi's poem again, the one about the Am I monk, mentioning his breathing is imperceptible, guarding his primordial ki.
Guarding primordial ki.
And Cao Wandu, in his 1784 preface to the hand combat classic, describes his dream revelation that led him to understand the subtlety of ki training. And Chan Naizu, another figure from the period associated with internal arts, provides vivid, almost mystical descriptions of the sensation of ki flowing.
What kind of descriptions?
Things like being startled or experiencing internal thunder and lightning, very experiential language.
These descriptions make it sound less like just physical exercise and more like a profound, internal, almost psychophysical experience.
They certainly convey that sense of internal cultivation. The source also mentions Wang Ziyuan, a Qing official and martial arts enthusiast who studied at Shaolin around 1882.
Wang Ziyuan, okay.
His manual included detailed gymnastic exercises like the 12-section brocade, which integrated limb movements, breathing, self-massage, and meditation techniques such as sounding the heavenly drum by covering the ears and tapping the back of the head.
And he experienced tangible benefits from this practice, not just spiritual ones.
Yes, Wang Ziyuan personally testified that practicing these exercises into his 60s gave him the physical stamina he needed to keep up with his demanding bureaucratic and ritual duties, allowing him to perform strenuous tasks like kneeling for long periods during ceremonies without difficulty.
So these seemingly esoteric practices had very practical outcomes for health and endurance, even for an official. But let's circle back to the Yi Jin Jing. You mentioned it likely originated in the 17th century, maybe 1624, but it's often attributed to Bodhidharma through a preface that's, well, you said spurious, fake.
Yes, this is one of the key findings Shahar highlights regarding the Bodhidharma myth. While the manual itself is likely from the early 17th century, a very famous preface became attached to it that falsely attributed its authorship to Bodhidharma.
Ah, the Bodhidharma martial arts myth returns. In textual form this time.
Exactly. This preface claimed that Bodhidharma left the Yi Jin Jing hidden inside the wall he meditated in front of at Shaolin. It stated the manual was transmitted via his disciple Huix Mero, a reference to the Chan lineage transmission stories.
Okay, weaving it into the Chan narrative.
And it claimed it was later passed down through a completely fictional figure, the bushy-bearded hero from Tang Dynasty popular fiction, and even supposedly translated by historical figures who lived centuries apart, like the monk Pramiti, who lived much later.
So it's a messy mix of history, fiction, and outright anachronisms designed to look authentic.
Precisely why Qing Dynasty bibliographers, who were meticulous scholars, recognized it as spurious. They pointed out numerous historical errors, attributing the Taihei reign period to the wrong emperor, having Pramiti translate the texts centuries before he was born, treating legendary or fictional characters as historical transmitters. It just didn't add up historically.
So who wrote this fake preface?
The likely author, based on internal clues, styled himself the purple coagulation man of the way. Likely a Taoist figure who seems to have taken significant liberties with history to create a prestigious lineage for the text.
So the specific connection between Bodhidharma and Shaolin martial arts, particularly linked to this Sinew's transformation classic and its daoyin exercises, seems to stem from a forged document created centuries after Bodhidharma's time, possibly by a Taoist. Why attribute to Bodhidharma then? Why not a Taoist sage?
That's the million-dollar question. The source suggests this attribution, particularly the link between Bodhidharma and physical cultivation or gymnastics, daoyin, might have originated with Taoist authors in the medieval period, perhaps as early as the 11th century in encyclopedic texts.
Why would Taoists attribute their practices to a Buddhist saint?
They may have done this out of genuine ignorance of Shaolin's actual martial origins, like the Vajrapâni cult or the Tang military service. Or, perhaps more strategically, it could have been part of a broader syncretic trend attributing beneficial practices, including some originating in Taoism, to prominent Buddhist figures to enhance their own legitimacy or appeal across religious lines, borrowing Bodhidharma's fame, essentially.
Using a famous Buddhist saint to give their practices a different kind of prestige or broader acceptance. Interesting tactic.
It's a plausible explanation. What's important is that historically, up until the 17th century, Shaolin monks themselves seem to have maintained a clear distinction. Bodhidharma was their Chen patriarch, the founder of their meditation lineage. Vajrapâni was their martial progenitor, the divine source of their fighting skills. They didn't link Bodhidharma to fighting themselves initially.
So Shaolin absorbed the Bodhidharma martial arts legend later on. It wasn't original to them.
Yes, the source indicates this attribution was gradually adopted by Shaolin monks themselves, likely in the mid-Qing period, maybe the 18th century. This seems to correlate with the increasing popularity and circulation of the Yi Jinjing manual, with its forged preface linking it directly to Bodhidharma and Shaolin.
So as the monks started using the manual, they also adopted its legendary origin story.
It seems so. And eventually they began attributing specific exercises like the 12 exercises of Wei Tuo, Wei Tuo being a form of Vajrapâni, interestingly enough, the famous 18 Arhat's hand, a foundational routine, and even a specific weapon, the Bodhidharma cane, a T-shaped staff, to Bodhidharma himself.
So the legend, possibly originating outside Shaolin, was later incorporated into the temple's own narrative and even influenced the naming of their forms and weapons. That shows how powerful and adaptable myths can be.
It's a fascinating example of how mythology can be retroactively integrated into a historical institution's identity, especially when it serves to enhance prestige or explain perceived origins in a compelling way.
This takes us towards the later history of Shaolin, particularly its decline, which seems to overlap with the turbulent transition from the Ming Dynasty to the Qing Dynasty in the mid-17th century.
Yes, Shaolin maintained strong loyalty to the Ming Dynasty throughout its final decades.
And this loyalty ultimately cost them dearly.
It did. The source details their involvement in the Ming government's increasingly desperate and largely unsuccessful campaigns against the major rebel armies, led by figures like Li Zicheng and Zhang Shanzong in the 1630s.
So they were fighting for the failing Ming government against rebels.
Yes. Shaolin monks were even drafted to help train local militias in places like Shanzhou County in 1635, where they initially scored a victory before suffering defeats. The Shaolin staff expert Hongji, who was apparently Xing Zongyu's teacher, the guy who wrote the staff manual.
His teacher, wow.
Yes, Hongji was killed in battle fighting the rebels around 1640.
So high-level masters were dying in these conflicts.
Yeah.
And the monastery itself suffered destruction.
Tragically, yes. Li Zicheng's rebel army swept through Henan in 1641. Because of Shaolin's staunch support for the Ming and its strategic location near Li Zicheng's own base, known as the Imperial Fort on Shaoxi Peak, his army attacked and razed much of the monastery.
They destroyed the monastery.
Yes, and according to the sources, they also brutally killed most of the monks residing there at the time.
So the fighting force, the historical Sengbing associated with Shaolin, was effectively wiped out by the Ming rebels under Li Zicheng before the Qing dynasty even came to power in 1644. That's a crucial point.
That's the conclusion presented in the sources, yes. By the time the Manchu forces of the Qing entered China and established their dynasty, the historic Shaolin fighting force was essentially gone, destroyed in the chaos preceding the dynastic change.
Is there evidence of their loyalty even after this destruction?
Yes, a 1677 stele at Shaolin lists the names of around 70 martial monks who fought under the Ming minister Yang Sichang around 1640, serving as a somber record of their continued loyalty and sacrifice for the Ming cause, even as the dynasty was collapsing.
That explains the physical decline and the loss of the fighting monks. How did Shaolin navigate its relationship with the new Qing dynasty after that devastation, especially given their Ming loyalty?
The relationship with the king was consistently marked by mutual suspicion, despite periods of formal imperial patronage, like visits from emperors.
Why the suspicion from the Qing side? Weren't the fighting monks gone?
The Qing government was highly sensitive to potential rebellion, especially from groups they couldn't fully control, like religious sects or martial arts societies. They were apprehensive that trained monks, even if fewer in number or less organized militarily, could potentially align with anti-Qing sectarian rebel groups.
They worried monks would join rebels.
Yes. The source cites a memorial from a Qing official named Yartu in 1739 expressing concern that Shaolin was attracting worthless dregs and violent criminal types under the guise of martial arts training, and that heterodox sects were actively targeting these individuals for recruitment.
So the king saw the martial training at Shaolin, even in its reduced state, as a potential breeding ground for rebellion. This leads us directly to the famous, or perhaps infamous, myth about Shaolin and secret societies like the triads, doesn't it?
Absolutely. This is where the widespread triad origin myth comes in. A legend, which originated primarily in South China, far from Hunan, claimed that the Heaven and Earth Society, the infamous triads, was founded by Shaolin monks.
Founded by Shaolin monks.
The myth claimed these monks supposedly escaped a Qing destruction of the temple, which, as we've just discussed, was actually destroyed by Ming rebels, not the king.
Right. The timing and perpetrator are wrong in the myth.
Exactly. And the myth claimed these fugitive monks founded the society with the explicit goal to overthrow the king and restore the Ming.
So the myth got the details of the destruction wrong. But the core idea, Shaolin monks being anti-king and pro-Ming, resonated with Shaolin's actual history.
That's the argument from the source. While the myth is spurious as historical fact regarding the Henan Shaolin Monastery's direct involvement in founding the triads, it reflected several underlying realities. Shaolin's widespread fame as a martial center, its actual historical loyalty and sacrifice for the Ming, and the genuine suspicion the Qing government harbored towards monasteries as potential centers of rebellion.
So the myth, even if inaccurate in its specifics, captured the temple's reputation and political leanings, making it a powerful founding narrative for a secret society seeking legitimacy and a rebellious image.
It certainly enhanced the secret society's image by linking them to a renowned martial center known for its loyalty to the deposed Ming dynasty. It tapped into that potent symbolism.
This whole journey through history and myth brings us back to that central tension we started with. How did Shaolin reconcile its religious identity and ethics with its martial practices over time?
As we discussed earlier, the source suggests the primary way Shaolin monks found justification for their martial practice internally was through the veneration of powerful, often violent, Buddhist deities like Vajrapâni.
The protector god with the staff.
Right. This cult reflected the tension within Buddhism itself, between the ideal of nonviolence, ahimsa, and the practical or even theological need for protection from evil forces or obstacles to the Dharma, the Buddhist path. Protecting the faith or the community could, in their view, justify setting aside the strict rule against violence.
So protecting the faith, the monastery, the Dharma itself could provide a higher justification.
That appears to be the most compelling internal religious justification presented in the sources for Shaolin's specific case. And it's interesting to contrast this with martial styles that developed largely outside the Buddhist monastic context, like Taiji Quan, Xingji Quan, and Baguazhang.
The so-called internal styles often associated with Taoism.
Yes. While these are also deeply linked to spiritual and philosophical ideas, their language and cosmological framework come predominantly from native Chinese traditions like Taoism and classical philosophy concepts such as the supreme ultimate Taiji, yin and yang, the 5 elements, and the 8 trigrams, Bagua.
So different martial traditions drew upon different spiritual frameworks to integrate the physical and the metaphysical aspects of their practice. Shaolin used a Buddhist one focused on protector deities and bodhisattva manifestations, while others used Taoist and cosmological ideas native to China.
Exactly. They both sought spiritual depth and a framework for their practice, but anchored it in different religious and philosophical traditions.
Pulling all these threads together, the history, the myths, the staff, the hand combat, the deities, the politics, the health practices, what's the big picture that emerges from Shahar's analysis?
We see a really complex and evolving picture of Shaolin. From the late Ming onwards, particularly, we see the clear development of this triple synthesis, the integration of religion, Buddhist justifications, deity cults, healing, drawing from ancient daoyin and later Kai cultivation theories, and fighting, staff, hand combat, military service.
Religion, healing, and fighting all interwoven. And the temple itself remained essential to this synthesis.
Absolutely. The sources reinforce the enduring importance of physical temple spaces, including Shaolin, as crucial centers for martial arts practice, demonstration, community gathering, and transmission, even linking these practices into broader village rituals and religious festivals sometimes.
It's a picture far richer, more complex, and certainly more contradictory than the simple, almost sanitized image we often get from popular culture, isn't it?
Definitely. We've moved from the popular myth, followed the historical evidence presented in the sources, and seen how legends like the Bodhidharma one continued to evolve and shape the narrative, even being adopted by the monastery itself later on.
We've seen that Shaolin monks did indeed practice martial arts and fight, sometimes with great effectiveness, and that this wasn't always a neat fit with their monastic vows.
And their justification often came from pragmatic means protecting property. And importantly, from their specific religious veneration of martial deities like Vajrapâni, which provided a theological basis.
Their martial history is deeply connected to their economic situation, their political allegiances, especially their notable loyalty to the Ming, and the broader sweep of Chinese martial arts development, integrating ancient health practices and developing both staff and later bare-handed techniques.
And the powerful legends, while often historically inaccurate for the Henan Temple regarding specific events or origins like Bodhidharma teaching martial arts from the start, or the triad founding myth being literally true for them, still accurately reflect Shaolin's immense fame, its real political stance during dynastic changes, and the climate of suspicion it navigated, particularly under the Qing. The myths tell their own kind of truth about Shaolin's place in Chinese culture.
It leaves you thinking, though, about the enduring power of these stories. The image of the warrior monk, perhaps even more than the detailed, complex historical reality we've unpacked here, has captivated the global imagination for decades now.
It really has.
What does the lasting appeal of the Shaolin myth tell us about the kinds of stories we find compelling stories about discipline, strength, and that mysterious, maybe aspirational intersection of the spiritual and the physical realms?
That's a great question to ponder. It suggests perhaps we are drawn to the idea that intense physical training can lead not only to mastery of the body, but also to a deeper spiritual understanding or transcendence, even if the historical path to that ideal was often messy, violent, and full of contradictions.
A lot to consider indeed. That was a truly deep dive into the history and myth surrounding Shaolin.
Indeed, a fascinating place, both historically and culturally.